Last night, President Trump held a press conference at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and announced two shocking proposals. First, that the quote, U.S. would take over the Gaza Strip.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it.
He also suggested that Gaza's entire population would be relocated to other countries.
Instead, we should go to other countries of interest with humanitarian hearts, and there are many of them that want to do this, and build various domains that will ultimately be occupied by the 1.8 million Palestinians living in Gaza, ending the death and destruction and, frankly, bad luck.
Israel and Hamas are meeting this week to negotiate the next phase of their tenuous ceasefire agreement. Richard Haass is here to help us make sense of this very complex situation. He is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations and a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. I'm so happy to see you, Richard. You're one of the first people I thought of when I witnessed this press conference. What was your reaction to this whole idea?
Katie, just when I think I can't be surprised anymore, I'm not just surprised, but in this case, this was way outside any box. And I've been working these issues literally for 50 years. But to double down on what the president said a week ago about essentially transferring, resettling, choose whatever word you want, roughly 2 million Palestinians out of Gaza, distributed around the Middle East, is a truly radical idea that ignores an awful lot of reality and history. And at the risk of getting ahead of ourselves in the conversation, it's not just a non-starter, but it's a dangerous one because it could set in motion certain developments or trends, particularly if the president takes his own idea seriously and tries to make it happen.
It seems to me incredibly destabilizing. There's so many things we have to unpack here, Richard, but some have likened this to a real estate development deal. In March of 2024, Jared Kushner said Gaza's waterfront property had great potential to be very valuable and suggested Israel should remove civilians while it cleans up the strip. So is this some kind of development deal where you're going to see Trump Towers constructed in Gaza? It is so bizarre, isn't it?
Well, we're not going to see that because 2 million or so Palestinians are not going to voluntarily leave Gaza or anywhere else. So the idea that this is going to be the Riviera of the Middle East or anywhere else, again, is not going to happen. But again, it worries me because it signals a lack of appreciation of the history, of the plight of the Palestinians, of what this could. There's also an irony here, Katie. When Zionists were looking for a country of their own in the first half of the 20th century and even late 19th century, different ideas were put forward, including in Latin America and Africa and so forth. And these were roundly dismissed. The whole idea was to connect with the Old Testament, with the Jewish homeland and so forth. So why does anybody think that the Palestinians are going to be bought off by moving somewhere else or else's in the Middle East? They also feel an attachment to land. So not only is this going to go nowhere, but it's a distraction from the real challenges of diplomacy, which are, by the way, not just potentially in the interests of Palestinians, but also in the interests of Israel. If you're like me and you want Israel to forever be a democratic Jewish state at peace that's prosperous, I see this as a dangerous distraction.
Can you give us a brief history of Gaza, if you could, for a second? Because I think people need to appreciate what Gaza actually is.
Okay, Gaza is, if I remember correctly, is not even the size of Manhattan. It's the most densely packed piece of real estate on the planet. We're talking about a couple of million people in a very, very small area. It was administered by Egypt for decades. And then in the 1967 Six-Day War, it became part of Israel. unlike the West Bank, what Israelis call Judea and Samaria, it doesn't have real biblical significance. It was never emotionally and politically loaded. It was kind of no man's land. The Egyptians didn't want it. The Israelis didn't want it. The Palestinians had it. It kind of was drifting, wasn't being developed. Then in 2005-06, you had elections there. The Bush 43 administration, I thought, unwisely pushed elections, particularly the format of the election. So what happened was the Palestinian Authority, the more moderate Palestinians there and elsewhere, ran multiple candidates. They split the vote. The Hamas candidates won. They were much more disciplined. Hamas, as I think most viewers know, is not just the group that carried out the October 7th, 23 attacks, but in its charter is devoted to the elimination of a Jewish state, of the state of Israel. They did nothing with Gaza in their subsequent decades of running it after the elections, after a brief civil war with the Palestinian authorities. So it's just this part of the world where virtually every index of human development, it's lagging. It really is as underdeveloped as you can get, and a lot of this blame, is on the Palestinian leadership, Hamas itself. The Israelis have made difficult situation at times more difficult, particularly since October 7th. But that's where we are. And when you think about the future, at least until the last couple of days, the question was, what would be the relationship ultimately between Gaza and the West Bank? 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, roughly 3 million in the West Bank. Could you think about one Palestinian entity, maybe two, because their paths have been somewhat separate? The immediate question is, again, the ceasefire. We can talk about it, but essentially it's had its own increasingly separate history, and it's been one of real failure in terms of economics and human life.
What would you say, Richard, to people who hear that and say, gosh, well, maybe the United States should be there? It seems like a hopeless situation. It's been forever embroiled in turmoil, and there doesn't seem to be any solution. Perhaps this is a good idea. What would you say?
Well, it's one thing for the United States or any other outside actor to take responsibility for something if the locals want it. I may have missed it, Katie, but I don't see the Palestinians there want it. We shouldn't want it, by the way. Why would we want to be potentially so enmeshed in a nation-building project? And that's what we're talking about there, particularly one that might be resisted or would be resisted by a percentage of the population. Forced transfer of these people is against all sorts of international law and human rights. And I think it would make Americans vulnerable throughout the Middle East. I think it would make several regimes, several governments vulnerable, including Jordan, Egypt, and others in the Middle East. Plus, there's a better alternative. The choice is not between Hamas running Gaza and the United States running Gaza. That's an artificial choice. There's a third option, which is responsible Palestinians who sign up to living in peace with Israel running Gaza. That's what we should be encouraging. That's what Israel should be allowing. It is not. This Israeli government won't allow that. But that's the way to go. What we want to do is marginalize Hamas, and we want to set in motion a process by which responsible Palestinians get a chance to run Gaza. They'd work with Arab countries like the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, obviously Saudi Arabia. They'd work with the United States and Europe. That's the project done with Palestinians, not to Palestinians.
That makes all the sense in the world to me, Richard. But why has that been so difficult to achieve?
It's been difficult for several reasons. One is the Israeli government. You have powerful forces in the government and outside the government in Israel that don't want to see responsible governance come to Gaza, in part because they worry that will set in motion dynamics that would lead to a Palestinian state, not just in Gaza, but on the West Bank, which is the last thing the 500,000 or so settlers want, and their right-wing political backers in parliament and beyond. Also, some Palestinians. There's splits within the Palestinian world, and there's also a real leadership vacuum in the Palestinian world. So it's, I think, a reasonable idea, but getting from here to there, needless to say, as the last 50 years show, is easier said than done I would simply say take baby steps, lay out vision, lay out conditional paths, lay out timelines, and begin to move in that direction. But it would take Palestinians themselves willing to act professionally and accommodate legitimate interests of Israel. It would take Israel opening up some space, and it would take help from the Arab world, probably some kind of a temporary stabilization force, because you don't want Hamas to reemerge, as we saw the other day, out of the tunnels. And it would require help from the United States and Europe.
Let's talk about the reaction from various quarters to this idea. Bibi Netanyahu, during this press conference, seemed receptive to this idea, to say the least. Talk about how this plays into the hands of Netanyahu and his right-wing constituency in Israel, and in the United States, for that matter.
Katie, I think you have a future in diplomacy. Receptive is a nice understatement. I think Bibi Netanyahu felt he died and went to heaven. There he was, sitting with the president of the United States, who he obviously wanted to see elected as president. And the president of the United States was espousing a point of view that if Bibi Netanyahu had espoused it a week ago, he would have been vilified for it throughout the region and much of the world. Would have been applauded by his own right, who loved the idea of transfer, getting Palestinians out of Gaza. Well, what they love is the precedent it sets, because what they really want is to get many Palestinians out of the West Bank, again, what they call Judea and Samaria, so Israel can expand settlements and annex this land. So for the president of the United States to be articulating this kind of a radical vision that is popular on one side of the Israeli political spectrum is more than Bibi Netanyahu ever could have dreamed of. Second of all, it means he's not being pressured to do some of the things he and his colleagues in government don't want to do, which is take certain steps to, rather than transfer Palestinians, give them a political stake in their future where they're living. He much prefers not to do that. He's resisted that for what now? For decades. So rather than getting pressured by the new American president to do things he didn't want to do, he was given a green light in ways. Based on his facial expressions, my sense is he was unprepared for exactly what President Trump said and how far President Trump went. Again, if Bibi Netanyahu had said those things, he would have been ridiculed or vilified for it.
Let's talk about the reaction from Hamas and this delicate, fragile ceasefire that's going on, which has its own host of problems, but hostages are still in Gaza. What do you think the reaction of what's left, I guess, of the Hamas leadership will be?
Well, Hamas will actually welcome this, not in the sense they'll endorse it, but it's good for them. This is such a stark proposal. It's such a radical proposal that it makes it easier for radicals to act like radicals. And Hamas can point to this and say, look, we're the only ones who are fighting for a Palestinian place in Gaza. We don't see our future in Egypt or Jordan or anywhere else. We've got the Israelis against it. We've got the Americans against it. You Palestinians need us. We're the only ones willing and able to take on all these people who intend us ill. So for Gaza, for Hamas, what's so unfortunate about this proposal is that if you discredit traditional diplomacy and moderation, what you do is legitimize radical behavior, whether it's armed behavior or proposals. And that's part of the unfortunate consequence of this.
Let's talk about some other Arab nations. Jordan and Egypt, as you know, Richard, have already said they would not absorb the Palestinians in Gaza. So how might they react? And then I'd like to ask you about Saudi Arabia and some other Arab nations. But first, Egypt and Jordan. It sounded as if President Trump thought he could force these countries to allow Palestinians to resettle there.
Well, I don't think we've necessarily seen the end of President Trump's efforts to do just that. If my numbers are right, Jordan and Egypt are the second and third largest recipients of American aid in the region after Israel. And if my memory is also right, aid to Egypt has continued, but aid to Jordan has been frozen. So it's quite possible, I don't know this, but it's quite possible that pressure will be put, heavy pressure on both governments to take in Palestinians from Gaza. Jordan's already, I don't know, Katie, what, 60, 70% Palestinian.
Right.
The king sits on, shall we say, sits on his throne uneasily. And I think
Tanya is Palestinian, as you know, his wife.
right, but exactly. And 2/3 of the population is Palestinian. There's always been a balance between the Hashemite monarchy, essentially Arabs who have more links to the desert, to Bedouins, as opposed to Palestinians. And what worries me about this is this could destabilize Jordan, possibly same, similar things with Egypt, though I think Egypt is less vulnerable to destabilization as a result of this. I believe both the king and the leader of Egypt, president of Egypt, are due in Washington over the next 10 days or so. So the words we heard the other day may not have been, shall we say, casual. This could be part of a proposal that we'll see follow-up. And again, I think it puts a government like Jordan's in an impossible place. Either they say no to the president of the United States and they possibly lose, what, $1.5 billion or more of aid, which they desperately need, or they say yes to it, and I think it destabilizes the country demographically and politically. And so rather than solving the Palestinian problem, what you could have is a proposal that creates new crises in the region.
What about Saudi Arabia? They were starting to be significant partners, I guess, would you say, Richard, for the U.S. and kind of trying to achieve a peace in the region? Talk about the way the Saudis may react to this proposal. Are they going to hate it, like it? How do they feel?
They won't like it. Look, Saudi Arabia is let me take a step back. Saudi Arabia and the United States, after going through a very rough patch at the beginning of the Biden administration, largely over the killing of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi in Turkey, out of necessity, the Biden administration forged a pretty good relationship with Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia was about to normalize relations with Israel before October 7th. It might have been one of the reasons that October 7th was carried out when it was. Saudis that were essentially willing to sign on to the Abraham Accords. What they also wanted much more than any of that was a security accord with the United States and assistance for their fledgling nuclear program. All that was put on hold by October 7th. But the idea now has been to resurrect it, to get it going again. The difference between, say, October 6th, 15, 16 months ago, and now is the youth in Saudi Arabia have been somewhat radicalized by social media and traditional media because of what's going on in Gaza. So now the Saudis need something in order to normalize with Israel. The Saudis need quite a bit in the way of an Israeli statement of intentions towards a willingness under certain conditions over a certain amount of time to coexist with a Palestinian state. Without that, I don't see how Saudi Arabia can move ahead towards Israel. And I think it's just gotten much more difficult. If the president of the United States is saying we're going to resolve the Palestinian issue by transferring millions of Palestinians out of Gaza, it puts Saudi Arabia, I think, in a position, well, hold it, how can we normalize with Israel? Because the Israeli government will hide behind the American government. So I think this has made normalization with Saudi Arabia, basically the wealthiest country, the custodian of the two holy mosques, a critical country in the Islamic and Arab and energy worlds. I think it's made normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel more difficult.
The UN Human Rights Office, and you mentioned this, Richard, but it's warned that any forcible transfer or deportation of people from occupied territory would constitute a violation of international law. So, I mean, are there any guardrails that would prevent this forced transfer of 2 million Palestinians out of the region?
Well, the guardrails are Palestinian resistance to them and who's going to oversee it. And if you have people refusing to accept them. So I think, when I used to teach at the Kennedy School, we used to say that 90% of life is implementation. So it's one thing to articulate a radical vision like this. It's something very different to actually bring it about, to make it happen. So I think the principal guardrails may simply be one of the ability to implement and the roadblocks and the difficulties to that. To make a larger point, Katie, it's one thing for Elon Musk and the 47th president to ride roughshod over aspects of the U.S. government here in Washington and beyond. It's something else to try to run roughshod over other peoples and countries around the world. So I think this is just simply an order of magnitude far more difficult. And I think also if the United States finds itself isolated, as it would, if it tries to go ahead with this, we're going to find ourselves without partners in the Arab world. And even the Saudis and others who don't like distancing from the United States would be forced to.
What would be the ramifications? Do you see this resulting in violence? I mean, how do you see this playing out, even the very idea of it before it's executed?
Well, again, what worries me are several things. One is that radical Islamic groups in the region might use this as justification for going on the offensive. It kind of lets Iran off the hook. Just a couple of days ago, Iran was on its heels, thanks in large part to Israeli military action against Hezbollah and so forth. Well, now no one's talking about Iran. Everyone's talking about the United States and this proposal. I worry that in the West Bank, this will encourage further settler violence against property and against Palestinians, because what this does is sets the precedent of potential transfer. And for the settler movement and the Israeli right wing, the big prize is not Gaza. It's the West Bank, which is much holier, if you will, in their eyes. And then you have the obvious immediate violence potentially in Gaza. Again, it'd be one thing if this were, how would I put it, administrative or voluntary or consensual. Choose whatever word you want, but it's not going to be. And then the question is what then? I think you'd have riots throughout the Arab world and throughout the Islamic world, probably also in European cities where you have large numbers of Arabs and Palestinians and Muslims. It's always hard to predict the future. But I think if we were actually to go ahead and press this against resistance, I think it would be an error of the first magnitude. And what's so odd about this, Katie, here's a president who tends not to want foreign policy to be bigger than it needs to be.
I was going to ask you about this. It's so contrary to this whole notion of America first and retreating from the world stage when it comes to particularly military conflicts.
Well, my guess is this is what you get when you don't have a serious, rigorous policy process. You have a small, informal group. I'm not exactly sure. I haven't seen a journalistic TikTok. I'd love to see one on how this idea was floated and gained traction. Whether, as you said, suggested it before, it came from Jared Kushner or somebody else. But how did we get from this, shall we say, radical notion, untraditional to say the least, to the President of the United States going on about it not once, but several times, including in a formal meeting with the Israeli Prime Minister? How did we get there? And my hunch is it's what we don't have is a rigorous policy development process where people say, hey, you got to think about this history and this consequence, this cost, this risk. My hunch is what we have is something much closer to informal groupthink. And that's a recipe for calamity.
I also thought it was interesting that he said everybody I've talked to loves this idea. And it begged the question, who are you talking to exactly?
But you know what? I bet it's right for two reasons. One is a selective circle of certain people in Israel and certain friends of the president on and off the golf course. And second of all, there aren't a lot of people with this president who tell him things he doesn't want to hear. So when the president is wildly bullish or enthusiastic about an idea, no matter how flawed, I haven't noticed a lot of volunteers saying, Mr. President, here's 6 reasons why you don't want to do this. I don't think you get the chance to be a presidential advisor for long if that's your style.
He's also talked about buying Greenland, annexing Canada, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, all these sort of imperialistic ideas, which is surprising given his strident opposition to nation building in the past. And as we mentioned before, America first. Do you think this is designed, Richard, in some ways to distract Americans from what is going on at home?
Yeah, my honest answer is I don't know. But there's been a lot of it. It seems to be more than a distraction because it's a pattern. I mean, it's all the places you mentioned. The pressure on Canada and Mexico, the tariff wars, which were short-lived, the repeated Greenland talk, taking back the Panama Canal, now this. There's a grandiosity to this Trump administration we didn't see the first time. There's a kind of a hubris, a might makes right approach. So I think it might be more than a distraction. I actually think the president believes, the naming of McKinley in the inaugural. I think he sees this as in some ways his part of his legacy. And what worries me, and also Gaza is an exception here, but a lot of it's close to home. And it suggests to me a kind of American sphere of influence, which sets a terrible precedent if you worry about Russian and Chinese spheres of influence. So I can't sit here and tell you you're wrong, that it's not a distraction, or it might be that it's not mutually exclusive. He might be doing it to see what the effect is, might be a distraction. He might be serious about it if it turns out there's not much resistance to it. He may not even know the answer to your question, but it worries me because simply by talking about these things, we've changed perceptions of the United States. We've changed relationships. The long-term, say, consequence of what's happened with Denmark over Greenland or with Canada, we're setting in motion a world where countries will not want to partner with the United States. They worry that getting close to us economically or militarily makes them vulnerable to our whims. So that's a world where we have much less influence. It's a world where China and others have more influence. I worry that we're accelerating the emergence of a post-American world.
Those are very chilling words. And when you look at just 2 weeks of the Trump administration, and just to close things off, as somebody who's been a public servant for so long, who's been deeply steeped in the importance of the way the government works. And that's not to say some of the fat could be trimmed or the bureaucracy or improvements could be made. But it seems as if the Trump administration is trying to orchestrate a wholesale dismantling of the federal government. And I would just love you to comment on all the different things we've seen. I don't have time to name all 10 or 12 or 15 or whatever measures he is trying to take, but I would just love your opinion on this.
Well, it's funny you use the word dismantling at the risk of being self-promotional. So I was just drafting before we began my newsletter, Home and Away, for this week. And I was trying to add up everything we've seen over these couple of weeks. And there's an assault on government capacity, both its financial capacity, but its people, far broader and deeper than I ever would have imagined. AID, the Agency for International Development, but also the FBI, the CIA, State Department, you name it. And an awful lot of experience and professionalism and capability is going to walk out the door. And the last I checked, Katie, this is all taking place at a time where here at home, we've got any number of challenges. And in the world, you've got, for example, a China, Russia, North Korea, Iran axis and terrorist groups and what have you. And it's far more, it's all more radical than I ever imagined. And I don't quite remember that being the focus of the election. So when you vote, what this is a painful, costly reminder is that when you vote for a candidate or against another, you often get more than you bargained for. But this is when I was writing about it this morning, I said, look, last I checked, we did it. We won World War II. We won the Cold War. It stayed cold and never got hot. It ended peacefully on terms totally consistent with our values. We won the Gulf War. U.S. economy's humming along pretty well. It's the envy of the world. Americans, for the most part, are living longer and are wealthier than they were decades ago. So sure, we've made enormous mistakes domestically. Recently over the border, we made mistakes in Vietnam and Iraq. I get it. Government has made mistakes. But by and large, it's a pretty good record. It's a pretty good record. And what makes me nervous about the new team, the new administration, is they're fixing it a lot more than it's broke. And by that, I mean they're not fixing it. The radicalness, the scope and depth of what they're doing is far more than weeding out waste, fraud, and abuse, or some unfortunate wokeness. It's more than is warranted or justified. And I think we may wake up sooner rather than later and rue the day when we find ourselves with a much diminished government at a time we need a government, an effective government to meet a lot of the challenges we face.
Sorry to ask you one more question, but do you think cooler slash saner heads may prevail? Is there an opposition that can actually temper some of these things? Clearly, control is firmly in the hands of Republicans who are exercising compliance at every turn. Yep. But is there any kind of a counterpoint to what is happening?
So far, very little. You're right. Republicans in the Congress have been essentially not willing to stand up. We've seen it in the nominations. We've seen it in the unprecedented use of executive orders. We saw it in the January 6th pardons. We see it in the legal justification for the tariffs. I could go on and on. But there is a reach by the executive that is, I would say, at odds with history and the Constitution. Republicans may rue the day if we ever get a Democrat who ever tried to do the same thing. But in the meantime, we're vulnerable. Plus, you've got Elon Musk, an outsider without without much in the way of legal standing and so forth, with a writ that is quite unaccountable. As best I can do, Democrats are disorganized. There's no leader of the opposition, seem uncertain about how and where to push back. I think we'll get some relief in the courts, but I think the whole approach of the administration in some ways is to throw a lot of jello or spaghetti or whatever your metaphor is.
Right, flood the zone. So it's almost so overwhelming and people tune out.
And that people tune out, they feel powerless. But also, if you throw enough out there, and even if you have to walk back 25% of it, that still leaves you with 75%. And I think that's the calculation here, is just to do an awful lot at great speed and figure that, again, even if you're forced to retreat here and there, like they were on the executive freeze, and they may be on some other things, they will leave an indelible imprint. And I think that's the strategy of the new administration. So I don't see a lot of mechanisms so far, at least, or a lot of people standing up and to stop them. And it's interesting, Republicans seem willing to compromise or sacrifice their principles and their prerogatives, and Democrats haven't figured it out yet. So at the moment, it's a pretty open field. Here we are coming into the Super Bowl, use a football analogy, but it's almost as if there's an open field, running going on, and there's nobody there to do any tackling.
Richard Haass, thank you, Richard, so much for spending some time with us to kind of try to understand what's going on in Washington and, in fact, all over the world. Great to see you as always. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Katie. Always a pleasure.
And by the way, Richard has a great newsletter called Home and Away, and he is able to share his insights on the news of the week, and it comes out every Friday, and it's free. So I highly recommend it. I love reading it. Richard, thanks again.
Thanks, Katie. Be well.